So as I was saying, Dr. King, we just got through the conclusion of the FDA PDAC all-day advisory committee meeting reviewing the efficacy and potential benefit of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD in adult patients. Obviously implicative to the potential Lykos Therapeutics new drug application that we're anticipating a decision on later in August. The conclusion of the meeting wrapping with votes against supporting the overall effectiveness of MDMA for the treatment of patients with PTSD, as well as MDMA in combination with the FDA's REMS strategies, which we'll talk about in a little bit here as well, for the benefit outweighing the risk for the same clinical profile. A lot of discussion. I'm particularly fried in terms of the deliberation, dissemination of topics that happen here. There's a pretty novel subject at some point, just, not really sure how this is going to turn out, but I wanted to start with expert reaction from you, Dr. King. If you could just share some perspective on what exactly this means, sort of implication. Are you surprised? How are you feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually wouldn't say I'm surprised. It seemed, and I mean, just based on sort of what I was picking up, leading up to this, that it was probably going to be 50-50 in terms of what this committee would end up recommending. I think my initial takeaways are, yeah, one, not being surprised. And, part of that is just due to the awareness as, someone working in psychedelics that drug regulators are unfortunately really just not super well versed in understanding how this treatment works, and that our regulatory system is not actually equipped to evaluate and approve or not approve any sort of drug assisted therapy. And that's not, ignoring for the moment any of the specific critiques, many of which I think come from that lack of understanding, perhaps not all. But I think this kind of illustrates that some of the key points that have been raised illustrate the challenges of what other psychedelic protocols and companies are going to be facing in terms of how these things are going to get approved. So that's sort of my initial takeaway, I would say. I would add, though, that
Right.
just as sort of, this is irrespective of the medical decision, but this is the first time I think I've seen something like this with this much involvement and this diversity of speakers and people coming in.
Sure.
And so, while I think a lot of people are disappointed with the actual decision, it's been my experience both watching the parts of this that I was able to watch today, as well as being involved and participating to a certain extent in some state level initiatives to hopefully revise state level policy regarding psychedelics, that I've been very impressed that psychedelics seem to be drawing in people that might not otherwise be participating in kind of government processes. So, I think that's a good thing. It's something that people have strong opinions about and strong feelings about, and that's actually attracting them to kind of speak their mind in government settings, which is really what we need more of. So I appreciated seeing that today.
I would totally agree with that. I mean, I think that was a resonating tone that we heard and sentiment expressed even in the deliberations leading to that, large vote against the support of the recommendation at the end was the sentiment from committee members of there's a great endorsement here, not just from the patients who benefited, obviously, in the public hearing speaking discussion, but as you're alluding to as well, the diversity of caregivers with vested interest in this subject. We heard from an emergency medicine physician talking about the underlying impact of PTSD and what he sees in acute care situations and how this is such a critical public health issue. And the sentiment, of course, as you're saying there, of just how significant this is. And yeah, not for nothing, again, certainly not coming from an expert. It did feel like a legitimizing conversation, at least for a subject where we are. And again, that was some of the hurdles we ran into in terms of deliberating on this today, it seemed, was just like, what exactly are the finer guardrails that we're going to have to set to achieve an actual indicated application of psychedelic therapies, which is showing a ton of promise in this space. How are we going to get there? It felt legitimizing, at least to that point, to even point out the issues, right?
Yeah, just that there's I guess you could call this a national conversation. I mean, it's our
Sure.
federal government live streaming something where everybody has input, and
Yeah.
it's the first time I've seen anything like that happening. Yeah, I mean, it's the beginning of probably many conversations like this that are going to be happening.
Definitely, absolutely. So, talking a little bit more about the MAP trial data, the pivotal clinical trial data that was, supporting the Lykos new drug application that again will be decided upon in August for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of adults with PTSD. I wanted to get thoughts from you, Dr. King, because that was such a heavy component of deliberation from both Lykos presentations and FDA clinical review. Earlier in the meeting was breaking down the strengths, the validity of the outcomes of what we perceived. There was a bit of talk about, are these our barometers for success in treating PTSD? The DSM-5 criteria's role and interplay into that, as well as the limitations. I'm sure you're probably tired of hearing the phrase functional unblinding like I am just from listening in on the meeting, but those are major topics. What are your thoughts on the MAP trials?
Well, I think it's obviously an issue if you're going to make an issue of that. But for starters, one thing that I was disappointed in, I did not have the time nor the bandwidth to listen to the entire day, but I did not the parts that I tuned in for. I was disappointed that I didn't hear any mention or discussion of functional unblinding that can occur and that did occur in trials like for esketamine, Spravato, which was approved a couple of years ago by the FDA. It's a drug that, similar to psychedelics, it has a potent psychoactive effect. You really can't blind it. And in addition, there's a number of studies that have shown that patients in, standard antidepressant trials, often due to the physiological side effects of antidepressants, are tipped off that they've gotten the drug rather than the placebo. And so I think, on the one hand, functional unblinding is obviously a challenge with psychedelic drugs, owing as they do to this very potent psychoactive effect. But the conversation in the public sphere has mostly focused on that as if it's completely unique. And it really is a lot less unique in psychiatric clinical trials than we tend to think. And so in a way, it does seem that the extent of focus on this particular issue is a bit of a double standard that is being employed, in my opinion, partly because of kind of fear and stigma and concerns that don't actually have anything specifically to do with regulatory issues around whether MDMA is efficacious in these studies or not. I would say, a corollary to what I noticed and what I was surprised to see is a number of issues that were raised as critiques of trial design. So number one being the functional unblinding, just to say it again. The FDA, when one runs a clinical trial, just for people listening, when one applies to use a new drug, you have to go through the Food and Drug Administration. You got to submit something to the FDA and get something called an investigational new drug exemption, which allows you to use this experimental drug. So the FDA looks through with a fine-tooth comb every single last little detail of your study's protocol for using this drug before they give you the IND. So this is the case with any clinical trial involving a new drug where you need to get an IND. In the case of these trials, the FDA was even more involved because of the breakthrough status. So they were working very closely on trial design. And so they knew all along that this functional unblinding was an issue. And nevertheless, they approved this as a trial design, knowing
Right.
well, that this is going to be an issue. So, whether we sort of think that it's an issue impacting the data or not, it's a little bit surprising to kind of see this, 2 phase 3 clinical trials later being raised. There are a number of sort of smaller issues regarding safety that I noticed that also could have easily been determined and added in the study protocol. One person was saying, we don't know what would have happened if we'd done pre-discharge EKGs of everybody after they've been given MDMA. Could have easily been written into the study protocol. So again, I mean, it's not necessarily to justify any shortcomings of the study itself, but it makes me feel a little quizzical seeing these being raised by the same overall body that approved all these things in the first place. Yeah.
Right. There's essentially just a pretty big gap that we need to clarify between, I guess, lack of oversight from a sponsor versus something that we maybe need to sort of accept as a reality in the circumstances of what we're assessing, right? Again, like the reality of the circumstance being that functional unblinding is a reality. And I noticed that Lykos even, from the FDA notes had rebuffed against the suggestion of niacin or lower dose MDMA as an option, saying that could be potentially adverse event risk. And then you'd have the same situation of potentially biased efficacy showing greater support than you realize, which is, of course, the overall issue that we saw with the functional blinding in the first place. So,
Right. Although,
yeah.
one of the issues that one of the let's say alleged issues, but one of the suggested critiques with functional unblinding is not simply that it inflates the positive effects of the group that got the active ingredient, but that it may also reduce or cause more negative effects in the group that got placebo. So in a way, I think Lykos's rationale for not using a lower dose of a psychedelic. And for a lot of clinical studies, a very low dose of the same psychedelic drug is used to try to mimic some of the somatic effects, the effects on the body of the psychedelic. So they'll use for psilocybin, 25 milligrams as a psychedelic dose. Clinical trials have used something like 1 milligram of psilocybin, and that's the placebo. So MAPS Lykos had used low dose, not minuscule dose MDMA, and I think it was their phase 2 study where they used 30 milligrams as opposed to 100 or 120, which are more of a full strength dose. The participants in the 30 milligram group reported much more negative effects. It was very difficult for them to sit in the presence of the two therapists in that particular trial, having been given the low dose of MDMA. In retrospect, it does make one wonder perhaps if they had done something that was known to, maybe mitigate some of the positive effects on the other end, maybe it would improve the quality of the data in the eyes of the regulators, but not so sure.
Absolutely. And again, as well, that phase 2 trial data not pertinent or involved in the discussion that was hosted today too. So another circumstance of just, well, that's a little bit outside the realm of this vacuum that we've created today in the discussion. So thank you so much for that, Dr. King. In terms of, we already are going into it a bit. If you wanted to elucidate a bit more on the follow-up, the calls for follow-up, continued research, what more do you want to learn about this cohort and the care strategy itself based off of this discussion today?
I mean, I think, one of the issues that was raised was the lack of diversity in the study participants. I think that's a very valid issue, and that's a problem in essentially every single psychedelic clinical trial that I've seen published in the United States, and pretty much anywhere in the world, with the exception of one study done in Brazil that actually did have a diverse patient population. But, every other psychedelic clinical trial to date are white, highly educated, affluent individuals. And so, that does potentially raise issues of generalizability. So I think that's a broader issue for the psychedelic field in general. And I think, if Lykos has to go back and reconduct a clinical trial, I think that will definitely be an issue they'll be focusing on, as many of the regulators or the folks at the AdComm meeting today were raising. And I think that's a fair question. There's issues raised of potential abuse. So that's, I think that is, we know that MDMA, it's not zero abuse potential in comparison with more classical psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, which really do have a extraordinarily low abuse potential. We do know that there is a pattern of abuse in MDMA, not for everybody, but it's certainly not zero. So I think that's something I don't personally think that, that ought to be held against these studies. I think that's the kind of thing that you can collect in so-called phase 4 clinical trials as we sort of generate more data, but it's not something to be ignored. I did hear the term, however, related to that of questions of diversion, which I would be much more surprised to see that, given the REMS that's being proposed, having worked, with other controlled substances. My understanding of the way MDMA is being proposed to be dispensed, this is not the kind of drug that's going to be ever, you're not going to go to your pharmacy and get a prescription bottle filled with tons of MDMA capsules.
Yeah.
So I think, the question of actual diversion and the true meaning of that term is unlikely. So I didn't like hearing that today, but
Sure. Absolutely. Anything else that you're particularly with regard to follow up for safety? There's some discussion about a return to this, obviously this 3-dose regimen or 3-session regimen rather showing such benefit, but the proposed question of what about patients that we want to do a take two on and a year or two later, what if there is remission? Is there anything to that you want to see more of?
there's a lot of, I'm sure you're familiar with this. You graduated high school in 2001, and I've heard since 2001 that MDMA puts holes in your brain. And, some of that is from a host of neurotoxicity data that was gleaned from animal research in the 1990s, that unfortunately was, essentially just taking all sorts of different small mammals and injecting them with huge quantities of MDMA that are not mimicked, that don't parallel recreational dosing in
Sure.
humans. The study that led to the, MDMA putting holes in your brain is this Science article that was published in 2000 or 2001. And it was retracted ultimately because it was found out that the investigators had actually been administering, and this study was using recreational dose equivalents in large primates, right? So this was not like giving toxic doses to rabbits. This was giving an equivalent dose that humans usually are taking, and finding that there was dopaminergic neurotoxicity. The study was retracted because it was found that they were giving methamphetamine rather than MDMA. There was some egregious error in the trial. But this has primarily been what led to this sort of idea that MDMA puts holes in your brain. However, we don't really know what the impacts of long-term MDMA use or MDMA exposure is. So, I think that will be something to look for in terms of, what if, and I think this is the question that you're asking, I'm finally coming back to it. What if somebody doesn't respond to 3 treatments? What if they need to come back in a year? What if they need to get 4 treatments, once per month? There's a lot of questions on how frequently one can consume MDMA. There's some preclinical data, I think this is based on, that found that, serotonin transmission is disrupted for up to 500 days after a single MDMA dose. Whether that has any clinically significant meaning or not is unclear at this point. But that is something that we'll definitely want to know. Like, is there a maximum lifetime number of doses that can be administered? Is there an optimal frequency? Maybe these need to be spaced out more, maybe less. So I think, ultimately that will be collected in future trials, hopefully.
Excellent. Thank you for touching on that. I didn't think that was tangential. That was a great history lesson. I appreciate that. It's really cool to hear. With regard to the proposed FDA risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, I know we talked sort of offline briefly about just the details of that, seeming fairly straightforward in accompaniment with, again, approaching a novel and relative to everything else that we have regulated, complex care strategy. I wanted to ask, do you feel that we're on the right track with this REMS proposal? Regardless of the advisory committee vote, that in combination with MDA is not outweighing the risk relative to the benefit, or is this something that you think is in the right target, I guess, for treatment?
I think, yeah, from reviewing it, I think it's in the right zone.
Sure.
There probably are things that could be done to tweak it to make it better, but on the one hand, I think there's a lot of people that are very enthusiastic about the promise of psychedelics and the promise of MDMA, and understandably and rightly so, in my opinion, very cynical about the way that MDMA is currently regulated, which is just called a Schedule 1 drug, and the effects of the war on drugs and our sort of prohibition model, which has failed and wasted huge amounts of money. Right. On the other hand, I do think that doesn't mean that we can just open up the floodgates necessarily without a certain amount of harms occurring. Okay, so I think where you sort of set your little point on how quickly do you want to open the gates to this is sort of a political and sort of cultural decision rather necessarily than a biomedically informed one. But I do think, as a clinician, we have to think about, what are the effects of, being exposed to MDMA, and, basically you have, a large number of people who are going to be seeking these treatments out who've never been exposed to MDMA. In contrast, I think, to a lot of the research that's being done now, which is, tends to be conducted by people that are pretty familiar with psychedelic drugs, that this is not going to be the case once the FDA approves these things. There's going to be people that, have really no experience working with psychedelics, not a lot of knowledge on, sort of the way we think about how psychedelic assisted therapy works, regardless of whether it's MDMA or psilocybin or another psychedelic. And so I do think, from a clinical perspective, that does introduce potential risks. Right. So in my opinion, I mean, I think it's reasonable to have a fairly strict REMS, as a clinician. I might have different views of the clinician than my political views. But the REMS makes sense, and having a registry and having a way of, certifying people that are doing this and licensing facilities and having some degree of control over how MDMA is dispensed is important. The challenge, as the committee repeatedly talked about, and this is a challenge that I don't see any solution for anytime soon, is we know that the psychotherapy is crucial. We know that this works as an adjunct to psychotherapy. This can be contested, and some people have different opinions on this, and there's some controversy. Is it a genuine form of psychotherapy? Is it just psychological support that accompanies the drug? My opinion is no, this is a process of change. This is something that is catalyzed by the drug, but it is not the drug itself. And I appreciated that a lot of the speakers on the committee mentioned that as well, but they also mentioned the challenge of what is the FDA supposed to do with a drug plus therapy when the FDA is not tasked with regulating therapy.
Right.
And that's a really, I mean, if not being able to solve that question, solve that problem is going to be a barrier, I think it's going to be challenging to approve any psychedelic anytime soon, because we don't regulate therapy at the federal level. That's up to guidelines developed by national organizations as well as state licensing bodies, but it's not an FDA jurisdiction. So that's a really tricky question. And I think, the FDA needs to think about this, and, maybe Congress needs to think about this, how this is going to work, because there's not actually a precedent for this.
It's maybe unfair to ask if you have any creative solutions for that specific issue, because I did notice that too, of like, well, yeah, of course, you're going to get administered care very differently, very to vary from specialists.
Yeah, I mean, I think you would need a policy wonk for that, but perhaps, I mean, the REMS, I mean, I'm sure there's some restrictions on REMS, but I mean, the REMS that accompanies Spravato, S-ketamine by Johnson and Johnson is pretty restrictive. Now they don't govern the nature of psychotherapy, and I think it would be tough to build psychotherapy governance into a REMS.
Yeah.
But there may be a way to, establish some sort of licensing program if there is a universally accepted form of therapy that should accompany this, and that you can't actually get the license to dispense this or to do the therapy until you've done the training. So, it doesn't seem maybe completely impossible, but there's a lot of kind of checker jumps to do before that happens.
Absolutely. No, thank you for reviewing that. Sort of on some final notes here, if we just touch back again on the sentiment occurring over and over and over again, the framework of like almost every discussion hosted today around the current armamentarium that we have for PTSD being limited, regardless of where we stand right now with MDMA plus psychotherapy, and where do we stand in a couple of months, dependent on the FDA decision for this new drug application. What can we really derive from the pursuit of this research in terms of continuing to pursue novel PTSD therapy, which seems everyone involved in the call was in favor of today?
I think, most people that I heard spoke to the inadequacy of existing treatments for PTSD. And there's no question that PTSD is just wildly undertreated in my field. And there's a couple of ways of looking at this. And, I see this a lot in having conversations about the potential benefits for psychedelic assisted therapies for various different conditions. And you'll often run into, clinicians or clinician researchers who will point to, some like really high quality psychotherapy trial and point to the fact that it's not necessarily that there are no effective treatments. It's just that people aren't accessing those treatments, or they're not able to access those. And I do think that that is an important thing to think about. I mean, I'm very optimistic about the impact that psychedelics are going to have, across psychiatry. They're not going to be a panacea, but I do think, a lot of the benefits are compelling. There's no question that many of the speakers that we heard at the advisory committee, the people who'd gone through those studies, you don't get that from expectancy. You don't get that from hype. Thinking that you're going to get better does not lead to that degree of change. On the other hand, I think there is a lot of interest in psychedelics because they're exotic, they're sexy, they're new. And there is a tendency to ignore the fact that there are existing treatments that, if done correctly, are more effective maybe than what people are getting right now. That being said, I worked for 3 years at our MGH Center for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress Disorders. We have many psychologists, world-class, top tier, doing cognitive behavioral therapy based treatments for PTSD. Many people got better, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people can't tolerate treatment like prolonged exposure. It's too activating, so people drop out. And we saw that mentioned as well. So there are dropout rates that are substantial for a number of treatments. And just looking at the real world of patients with trauma spectrum disorders, saw this morning. Kelly O'Donnell was referring to the polypharmacy. These are patients.
Right.
The conversation, at the official level is, we have 2 SSRIs FDA approved for PTSD. After this call, I'm off to our emergency room, and I'm going to see, probably most of the people I see there tonight are going to have a trauma spectrum condition. And I guarantee you that most of them are going to be on 1 or 2 antidepressants, an anxiolytic, maybe a controlled substance, maybe 2, and probably an antipsychotic. And this is so common, people on, 6 or 7 medications that are still ineffective. They're still coming into the emergency room. They're still getting hospitalized despite that. So, I think the need is really significant. And at the same time, I think there's a lot of concerns about not letting that blind us to sort of implementing this in a safe way that protects people. So it's tricky. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting time. And on a kind of sociological level, this meeting is fascinating because this is kind of the first official public formal American review of medicalized psychedelics and what this eventually is going to look like. And if the FDA doesn't approve it in August, I think it's clear that eventually it will be approved. It's clear that eventually other psychedelics will be approved. And how we're actually going to figure out how to implement this in hospitals and clinics is a really tall order, and it's going to be a very interesting process to watch.
Absolutely. Just to add, I mean, I think it's something that we're privy to covering a number of different specialties on HCPLive. I don't think there's anything equivalent to psychedelic therapy discourse on other specialties, but we do see a recurring trend all the time of that exciting, sexy, new, novel drug, as you're alluding to. Everyone expecting to come in, knock the doors down, become the primary first-line treatment option right away. And that's generally not the result. New doesn't mean best, right? The most successful ones generally seem to know their confines, know where exactly it fits into the armamentarium. The clinicians endorse where it fits into that strategy. The patients understand that that's the work to it. So maybe this sort of serving, unfortunately, as something resembling a reality check for those people who have been very excited about this, reasonably so. Again, that's very promising clinical efficacy that we're seeing over and over with this, but maybe that was sort of incremental towards us eventually reaching, as you're alluding to, that realistic and final and confident building space that psychedelic therapy will exist in psychiatry. And we'll see that in coming months, years. Who knows what it looks like 5 years from now. Dr. King, thank you so much for this. I know you're on a time constraint. I really do appreciate your time and insights. Anything else you want to add relevant to the meeting today that we didn't get to mention?
No, no, it was great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This was really fun. I really do appreciate your time again. And hopefully we can talk a bit more about this. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit more news, so everyone should tune into HCPLive. Our psychiatry coverage will be going on throughout Psychedelics, not just this summer, but the years beyond. So stay
Sure.
tuned for more, and we'll stay
Happy
in
to come
touch with
back.
you, Dr. King. Yes, we love that. We love that. Thanks again. I really do appreciate your time.